All right. It's been a little bit of a yet another hiatus from my podcast, but nonetheless, I am so excited about tonight's episode. I had the privilege of meeting tonight's guest several weeks ago. We chatted, and I followed her work on a lot of social media, especially LinkedIn, and just see the amazing thing that's happening around the work she's doing. So, Natalia, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you are here. And the first question I always ask everybody is, how are you? And tell us your story.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy and grateful to be here. I'm well this morning, so it's evening for you, but it's morning for me. It's 8 a.m. in Singapore. So my story is pretty epic, but I'll share it in a nutshell. I'm a writer, speaker, therapist, and consultant, and the founder of Illuma Health. And my mission and our mission is to help co-create a trauma-informed world and repair and revitalize the way we look after ourselves and each other. And what got me here is a pretty long journey of healing my own trauma and growing up at that time in a world that could not recognize it, understand it, or support it. So I grew up in a lot of physical and emotional abuse, which later went on to cause me to have mental health misdiagnosis. I was misdiagnosed with bipolar and sort of stuck in that paradigm and on a cocktail of meds. And, my trauma was trying to speak. And after 4 years of hell, I did hear this little voice in my head that said, Natalia, this is not who you are and this is not your life. And so I checked into a rehab facility and I detoxed off all the meds and I was stripped of the diagnosis. You are now normal, tick, tick. But it wasn't long before the trauma started to show up in my body. And the first thing that happened was my gut completely shut down. And the next thing that happened was one day at the very young age of 24, all of a sudden at work one day, my right foot just stopped working. And of course I was terrified and I went to the hospital and I was told I had nerve damage and that I'd never walk again, which was really scary to hear. But I was always very determined. I've got a strong spirit. So I said, nope, that's not going to be my story. So I worked with this amazing physio and craniosacral therapist and he had me walking again in a couple of months. But because we weren't really addressing the root of the trauma, it kept speaking, it kept showing up in my body. So both my feet would stop working, sometimes my hands, I had them in splints for many years. And basically my nervous system was on fire from the trauma. And so over 11 years, it just started to morph and decontextualize through every system in my body. And at the depth of my illness, I was on 42 medications and having 3 intravenous treatments per month. And, it was awful. And the doctors told me, if this illness doesn't kill you, because it appeared to be degenerative, that the medication we're giving you will. And I was expected to be dead before 40. I turned 40 this year, and I'm the healthiest and happiest I've ever been in my life. But anyway, I searched everywhere to try and heal. And I looked at mainstream healthcare and mental health care. I looked through the gamut of complementary health and I looked through spirituality, anything. I wanted anything to heal. But it wasn't until I looked through the lens of trauma and also through somatics, through how that was showing up in my body and how to speak to my body, that I began to heal and had what doctors called a miracle recovery. But of course, it wasn't a miracle. It's just I looked to the root and I found the remedy. So my own journey sort of led me to want to work in this field, which I've been doing. And I've studied all around the world, many different modalities. I'm not a psychologist. My initial trainings are in hypnotherapy and regression and craniosacral therapy, the same modality that really, really supported me when I was in a lot of pain. And I guess that led me to work as a therapist and specialize working with people with trauma, often with complex conditions similar to what I had. And that then led me to open health clinics here in Singapore that really addressed this. Back then, even no one was talking about trauma. So our clinics were not overtly trauma clinics. We were like a Trojan horse. So people that were really suffering and not able to find healing through mainstream interventions would seek us out. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, everything erupted. Everyone's trauma was starting to come out. And I started getting these calls saying, Natalia, can you come and speak about mental health or burnout or loneliness? And so I did. And I started speaking and I realized the world is ready. And that's when I founded Illuma Health. And it feels like now the world is ready to listen to us talk about trauma and to start healing from it.
I before we came on to the podcast, I was mentioning the keynote that I've been giving is we're in the midst of opportunity, and I believe that, and I think you're right, Natalia. I think that collective trauma, because that's what it is, has opened the door for conversations that I don't think would have taken place. And we know you're in Singapore. I'm in the U.S. Ironically, my brother is in town right downstairs. He lives in Taiwan, and we were having this conversation about cultural context, and it is different, right, in different parts of the world. But at the end of the day, we all have gone through a collective traumatic experience. So I think I want to go back to your story because it is a compelling one. It's full of a lot of maybe adversity, right? But what I continue, and I've always heard when you and I have spoken, is hope and healing. But why do you think, or how does trauma continue to go undetected in the ways that it does? And I think a little context here is the way the ACE study started in the US was around health outcomes. And even to this day, getting medical providers to understand the physiological responses of trauma on the body is still something that we are trying to get across, because they're treating the symptomology, but they're not understanding the cause, right? So why do you think it goes undetected that way?
I think studying trauma is a relatively new field. And I think that this collective trauma that's occurred, it's something that's in line with the evolution of us as humans, as a species. And it's because we're not necessarily living in ways that are self-caring and that create harmony. We've gone so far away from how it should be, in my opinion. And so I think because it's so new, it's unknown. And as humans, we're so left brain and we so like to put things in boxes and frameworks that if there's a framework that's been living around or, being used for a really long time, we're going to orient there. We want to put something in a box because what's outside the box is unknown and scary. And it can also make us feel not so smart. So it's safer to stay here in the box. But I think what all of us who are working in the field of trauma-informed education and care are trying to do is to support everyone to start looking outside the box and to explore the story and the narrative, and link those dots, join those dots. And I think that it is happening, but I think we're at the very beginning, and this field of work needs a lot more research and a lot more frameworks and language and then strategies to be able to help us heal.
Absolutely. And I do have to commonly continue to tell myself this is our new field. It really is. And the research is growing drastically. And you and I were speaking earlier about the idea of hope. That is even more, it's even newer. Matter of fact, Dr. Segay's work came and Dr. Bethel's work came out just a few years ago, where they looked at 7 indicators of hope and how that played out, and that when children have these 7 positive experiences, the outcome of those positive experiences can outweigh the negative adversity, right? And so what I've always been kind of resonated with is that just because you have a high ACE score doesn't mean that you are destined to poor health outcomes or poor life. But it also means that you may have minimal adversity. And that doesn't mean you are exempt, because the driving factor are those relationships, that positive experience, and that connection that everybody needs, right? That human element. So let's get into that, because I think you have such an interesting perspective around this idea of the taboo of touch, and how does that play out culturally in any place, to be honest. But and as a principal, the video that of my school that went viral, went all over the world from Edutopia. One of the very beginning scenes is me hugging one of the students. And I've been in places where I've shown the video, and their response to the video, which was a well done, amazingly creative video, was, "Can't believe you hug students." And I said, "I can't believe you don't." I mean, he came up to me and hugged me. I'm not, I can't do that. So what are your thoughts around that?
Touch is probably the most powerful form of nonverbal communication, and we need it, but we've become so scared of it, and it's a huge problem. It used to be that in communities, touch was used for healing all of the time. And that's something that me and my team are wanting to bring back through our work. But we need to make it safe. If we look at it on a neuroscience perspective, when we are babies, we need touch in order to survive and develop and thrive. And so when we're born, ideally we come out onto our mother's chest and it's a full body touch. And there's science that shows children who are hugged more regularly actually develop into healthier, happier humans. And sadly, most of us did not get the level that we received. And because touch has become so taboo, and it's become taboo because some pretty awful things have happened, in our modern world, we've shied away from it, and it's bad, it's wrong, it puts everybody at risk. So we really need to find ways to make it safe, because just as we need touch in order to develop, when we are experiencing trauma or trying to heal, it's a developmental stage. So we need the same ingredients that we would have needed earlier on. And so how do we make touch safe? And I guess it's through conversation. It's through putting frameworks and boundaries in place that actually protect not only the person who is being touched, but protect the giver from potentially being, I guess, labeled or cast out as doing something wrong. And I think this is really, really, really big work.
Yeah, major paradigm shifting work. And I want to validate what you said. There's really awful things that happened, and in every sector, in every field. Unfortunately, I still see stories often about education, about healthcare, about faith-based communities. It is. And I think you're so right. When you go to the scientific neuroscience and development of human beings, it is a primary factor early on in life on understanding. And even that serve and return piece, that's kind of the next level. So it is science-based, but it's also like, how do we shift the paradigm in a way, right? Because I think it needs to happen. But you're right. Those safeguards, right, are so important. And another thing that I think that is powerful is teaching kids to say it's okay if you don't want to give someone a hug, if you're not comfortable. And, I've learned that when I was a kid, I remember my mom saying, well, give him a hug. And I'm like, I don't want to give this person a hug. I mean, it may be like a long lost cousin. I don't even really know. But we've never give kids the out of saying, no, I'm not comfortable with that. And even my own son, we've had that conversation. Like, no, it's okay to say, no, I don't want that right now. Or, yeah, you can give him a hug. I don't ask him for permission. I let him give his own permission, right? And I think that there's some power around that. But my son is and was and will always be hugged an insurmountable amount from his family, because we're huggers. I'm a hugger. That's just what I do. So what do you see as the next step for this work around changing the taboo and moving towards a safe space and place for people and kids to be able to heal through touch?
I mean, before we even get to touch, we have to come back and talk about boundaries, which is the topic that you're so beautifully talking about. So until we all have a much better understanding of boundaries, not only our own, but other people's, we're not going to feel safe. So boundaries help us feel relationally safe. And our generation were not taught how to put in boundaries or respect boundaries. So I think we have to come back here first. And when we're talking about boundaries, we need to start working with both permission and invitation. Is this safe? And would you like? They're two slightly different things, but they go together. And these are the nuances of respectful relating. So if we want to make touch safe, we have to come back where there's no touch. And when I teach our framework here with trauma-informed relational somatics, a lot of work goes into understanding not only expressed boundaries, but unexpressed boundaries. And because, it's very common for us to split from mind and body. So someone might say, yes, that's fine for me. And the body is actually saying, this is not fine at all. And either this happens because we're taught it's very good and right to say yes, or we actually cannot feel and tune into what's happening in our bodies. So all of this education needs to happen first before touch is safe. It's a really big job.
So powerful. And I think that's exactly right. I think, I expressed that about boundaries. And I mean, that was just the natural thought process that I had. But I do think it is healthy, right? And I think teaching those boundaries and doing a reset, because, hypermasculinity is a thing, right? And especially in the culture of the US, it's a thing. And we've seen the Me Too movement, right? And I'm going to go to that thought process of people thinking they had the right to hug and touch and inappropriately to colleagues, and like that's where it all went, because right, all of those things that you said weren't in place, where there weren't healthy boundaries. The person who was doing it didn't have boundaries, right? The person was probably in that state that you said, like, I know this isn't right, but or even said no, and then somebody did. So I think there's so much that we have to peel back of the onion and go, all right, let's start laying this groundwork, because there's so many layers to it.
Absolutely. So many people cannot express their no, their boundary, for the reasons that I've mentioned. And because most of us lack education around this, when it's not overtly expressed, the other person or people can't decipher that it's really no, and then they think, well, then it's fine, but it's not fine. So it's such a nuanced topic, and there's a lot of healing that comes for all of us in learning how to tune in, connect our mind and body, and have a full body no or a full body yes. And there's also so much power as a human that's wanting to create social impact in the world, which I'm sure everybody who's tuning into this does, to be able to listen to someone's verbal yes or to their silence, and to actually know that in truth it's a no, and respond to that. So we want to learn to respond to the unconscious and the unspoken, because sadly, as a humanity, most of us have lost our authenticity and our ability to express in a cohesive way that honors our boundaries and what we want and need.
So you went back, and I'm going to go back to some of the stuff you said, because we have listeners that are much more versed than I am, in the field of trauma-informed work. I know what the somatic process is, but for those people who don't know, can you just dig a little bit on what is this? What is that, right? Because I know that it's a common used structure, framework, thought process, science. And I don't know a ton about it, but I know enough just to be a little bit dangerous. So how do you describe the work?
Okay. So some somatic work uses touch and some doesn't. We use touch at Illuma Health and through the practitioners that we work with. Somatic work is actually seeking to speak to the right brain, to the nervous system and the body, to the unconscious non-verbal experience. So much of our experience lies there anyway, but all unprocessed trauma lies there. So if we're trying to speak to trauma or work with trauma from a left brain, rational place, we're not going to get very far. And so what somatic work does is it supports the client or the receiver to tune in to the body very safely, and start to connect with those experiences from the right brain and the nervous system and the body, and actually link it back up to the left brain, where we can start to make sense and integrate our experience. So in the case of trauma, what happens is there's an interruption or a change in the way the left and the right brain communicate. So they're not talking to each other very well. And a lot of somatic work is about repairing the dynamic between those two sides of the brain and linking the mind and body together. And when we integrate our experiences, they're no longer trapped inside us, and they're no longer kind of weaving their way through the way we exist and relate in the world. So that's what it's about.
And it makes me go back to think of the Bessel van der Kolk quote, which was, when it comes to trauma, you may not remember, but your body remembers. And I think that's exactly how I see that is it's that physiological response in our nervous system to stress and trauma. And it isn't just what we're going through now, it's what we could have gone through in the past. and that difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic states of how our body responds. And I think you're so right, is that it does take that understanding of, whoo, like, I'm feeling this experience right now in my body, and it may not be a good thing, right? And I've seen it in schools where, kids will ball up their fists, or they stomp their feet, or they'll hold their head, or their face gets really red. That's their body communicating, right, with their emotions. And yet we don't traditionally, the school that I led, we don't teach kids what that means and how to process that information. And I think that is exactly what we have to be doing in anywhere, schools and homes, to parents, to kids. Everybody needs to understand this, so we can get to where you said we are all in a space to be able to do these natural human interactions in a safe way that everybody understands. Like, this is the human interaction.
I think you're so right. And there's two things I want to reflect from what you've said. One is to support a student, or just a human in general, to understand what's going on in their body and interpret what that means in a very basic ratio of, am I experiencing safety or am I experiencing danger, is a really big first step. There's another piece, though, when it comes to somatics and trauma. The reason we are not tuning into those signals and responding to them is because it is not safe for us to do so. So it's not safe to be in the body when there's this high level of threat. So before we can make it safe for students or anybody to start tuning in, we have to build safety. And often that safety starts in a relational dynamic. And so that's where educators or therapists or leaders can start to work. If this child or this human doesn't have the capacity to process and feel, how can I increase their capacity through my dynamic with them?
I love that. And that is so true. And that's the power of relationships. And that's why this work is always grounded in relationships, right? And it makes me even go on to think about how this plays a role in self-care, right? How do we as educators, because this is the Trauma Informed Educators Network podcast, right? But how do we as educators, parents, professionals, how are we thinking and using these same tools in a way of self-care? Because Natalia, self-care is like, I don't know. In education, it is like, well, just, go do some self-care. That's not what I'm talking about. When I talk about self-care, I'm talking about the physical, mental, spiritual health of the human and adult that's taking care of themselves. And educators, unfortunately, have historically given up themselves to be who they are as an educator. And that can't happen, right? So let's get into this. How does self-care play such a major role in a educator, caregiver, therapist, human's life when we're talking about this work?
As a caregiver or facilitator, we are hopefully in the position of power. Therefore, our neurophysiological experience is dominant. And so it's going to have a direct implication on the person or the people that we are supporting. So if we want to hold the space and create a dynamic for regulation and healing, we have to be living and breathing that within our own nervous system. So if we're not able to self-care and we're not able to look after ourselves, our job's going to be very difficult. And not looking after ourselves is one of the reasons why perhaps teachers might get triggered, or go into burnout, because there's not an understanding of personal capacity, an ability to set boundaries, and ability to downregulate. And these tools are required in order to engage with students or a group in ways that really transform the experience. So some of the things we can start to do as care providers is to learn our own nervous system and to learn how to ground in our body, how to downregulate before we co-regulate. So that's like the adage of putting on our own life vest before we help someone else with theirs. And this is really important. And again, this is something that is not taught and something that's prevalent in the education system, in the healthcare system, in many sort of helping professions. is there's not enough resources. So most people that are in helping professions are completely burnt out, and they are not able to look after themselves. And when we go into depletion, and when we go into burnout, and when we go into dysregulation, it is near impossible to support someone else to regulate.
I just had this conversation with a colleague, and it comes down to me of psychological safety first, right? That if you are not in a psychologically safe space and place, especially in a school, it's really hard to do what you just said, right? And I'm going to give context. Test scores, right? Lists of failing schools, drills, lesson planning, all of these things speak to the lack of psychological safety for all adults. I mean, the system as a whole, by design, does not create a space of psychological safety for the adults. And in return, we are creating school cultures, unfortunately, that are not safe for kids. And so, again, this is why I have paradigm shift education. We know better now. The science is clear, right? We are starting to understand the things and the ways that we've always done things. We need to start thinking about, is this the way that it needs to continue to be? Because I know, as a principal for 7 years, the amount of things and the amount of pressure and the amount of shame and blame that happened in education, it was nearly impossible to create a true environment of psychological safety, because it always felt that we were unsafe. And I don't even mean physically, although there were times that did feel the case,
Yeah.
but emotionally it was not a safe place. So what do you see as a pie in the sky dream of next steps for what it could look like, in not just education, but in general?
It's so massive, and I think it's going to take a couple of decades for real
I
change to
agree.
occur. That's my
I agree.
honest feedback.
Yeah, I
I
agree.
believe I believe our generation's role is to focus on our own healing. And maybe that sounds selfish, I don't know, but I think we need to start here with this system, our own personal system, because it's from healing and mastering this system that then we can create social impact. So rather than give some, lollipop idea of, oh, let's just do these 5 or 6 things and everything will be healed, I don't want to do that. I feel so strongly our generation, our job is to heal our trauma, and to be happier and healthier. It is our children that will then go on to have a different experience. Their nervous systems will be different. They will be so much more authentic and able to express their boundaries and their needs and their desires. And I actually believe it is their children who are going to go on and really change the world. So that's my answer. Maybe
I
not what
love
everyone.
that. No, but that's exactly right. And I think we are in we have labeled the pandemic COVID pandemic. We've labeled all kinds of pandemics and epidemics, and we have yet to label trauma as being majorly pervasive across our globe and even in each of our countries. And that is exactly right. It is such a piece of almost every single culture, not every culture, because I believe there are cultures of healing. But it's become normalized that if we could simply just focus on healing ourselves and being there to support each other in each of our own healing journeys, you are right. That is like the next step. And it's going to take generations, because it's been many generations of harm that has been done. And sometimes that harm has been done by the systems in which we all live, right? I go back to thinking about historical context here in the US and the things that have happened over time in our history. It takes a long time to heal that on purpose. It takes even longer to pretend it isn't there and try to heal it in a different way. So I love that. I think you're spot on. I think it is about, we just need to figure out how we're going to heal ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I don't mean just me individually, but myself, my family, my experience, so that we can move on, and help others in the same process from generation to generation. So powerful.
The biggest way we can create social impact is through our own healing. So one of the beautiful things that I've experienced, and everyone that I've worked with has experienced, is that when we start to heal and come to a place of peace and power inside ourselves, automatically every single human we relate with experiences a shift as well. And it's usually our own expression from a more integrated and healing-centered place that ignites change in the world around us. So, you can never force anybody to heal or see things from your view, but what you can do is be embodied.
And I mentioned Dr. Sege's hope framework, and one of his pieces, authentic relationships, and I think that's key because so many times we see other humans based off of labels, based off of the way people look, where they live, instead of just literally connecting human to human. And that was one of the primary focuses of his work, was just looking at each other in a humanized way, of not seeing their political views, not seeing where they were raised, not seeing what school they went to, but simply just being present and seeing somebody for who they are. And man, I was like, that's just it. Because I was always told that I was a troublemaker, but I always hung out with the troublemakers. And I was like, yeah, because I thought they would. And I still find myself gravitating towards people because I constantly am looking, wow, they are amazing humans, no matter what. And I think we have to be in that human space. And especially here in the US, this is my only context, is everything is so polarized, right? You're this part of this political party, you're this part. You go to this church, you go to that church, you don't go to church, you're in this group, you're in that group. That people's identity is now not even in themselves as being a human, but an association with something that is outside of themselves. And I think that human connection is key. And I hope that we can, and especially in schools, that can be a focus, that we see each kid as a human, as one little human who has an amazing gift of whatever it is they're bringing to the classroom, and we can be a part of their positive outcome.
I think that's such a beautiful vision, and I completely agree with the need for authenticity. It's one of the key pillars that I talk about as well in terms of what has been lacking and what we need to heal. But I think we also need to acknowledge how difficult this is. So it's nice for us to talk about it, but the truth is, most of us have spent so long creating this version of ourselves to interface with the world. I call it external shell. So we've spent so long creating this that some of us don't even know what's beneath our own surface. And if everybody else has one as well, there's these two shields that are interacting. So it's really difficult to connect to the human and to connect to the heart. But it is actually what we're craving and the elixir to the wounds of the trauma. And I think for us to get there, we need to start learning, well, what is my shell? What is this suit of armor that I've adorned? And develop layers of safety inside ourselves and relationally that make it safe for us to slowly derobe, to let down those guards piece by piece. So again, I think that it is a slow process. And when we are sort of trapped underneath our own armor, again, we need to harness the power of dynamic for someone else to make it safe for us to slowly take one down. And that usually comes from what I call reaching in as an imperative for healing. So if we learn to sort of discern and understand what's beneath the armor, we can actually say, hey, I see you in there. I see this part of you. Would it be safe for that to come out now? And there's incredible power in reaching in, because for those of us that are really trapped in our trauma, we can't heal without that.
Wow. So, it's so powerful, and it's work that it is complex, right? And it's very complex. And so, having heard all of your thoughts, what would you tell an educator who's like, okay, now what does that mean for me as someone who's going to stand in front of 25 kids who are 8 years old in August when I come back to school, because we're on summer break here. But what would you tell an educator? Well, okay, this is all, but what does it mean for me?
The first thing will be to start learning your nervous system, learning your own external shell, learning the triggers that blow it apart. That's where we start. When we can understand it in ourselves, we can more easily start to understand in our students and start to engage from responsiveness, not reactiveness. And it's not an easy job. It's not linear. It takes years, but we can start. And if all we do is learn to tune into the question, am I experiencing danger right now, or am I experiencing safety? And what can I do to feel a little bit more safe inside myself? That's a really big starting point.
And man, how if we could all just take that first step, how powerful would it be? So I do ask one question kind of close to the end, and I'm going to ask you, and I want you to put some thought into it, because I do have a lot of educators listen to this, thousands actually, and we told them, hey, here's something to consider for the next step. But from your perspective and your experience, what do you want educators to know? What do you want them to know about their work? Not what they need to do, but from you as a human being, who I'm assuming went to school at one point in your life, right? Or many points in your life. What do you want educators to know right now from you?
That you are in such a position of power to change the world simply through every breath that you take, every smile that you give, and every interaction that you have with the children, and that I'm grateful for you, and that I hope that you're able to care for yourself as you do this amazing work in the world. That's it.
And that's powerful. And I will tell you, that reminded me, I don't know if you know the work of Dr. Karen Treisman out of the UK, but she has a quote that says, every interaction is an intervention. And that's exactly what I heard you say, is that we do as educators have so much power. And when I hear you say power, I don't mean power of like authority. I mean power of influence and power of connection and power to be that one person that could be that shift for a kid to realize, wow, I am important. I do matter. Or wow, that teacher was always there for me in those moments of crisis when I wasn't there for myself, but they always were in that space. When I hear power, that's what I hear. And I hope educators realize that despite all of the mess that you have to deal with, you still are in a position that you can support so many kids. Dr. Perry was on here, Dr. Bruce Perry, in his work, in his multiple pieces, he found in his research that those micro interactions of positive interactions, those what you just said, standing in those spaces of, I'm glad you're here. Wow, you're doing great today. You look really frustrated. Do you need a minute? Those validations in higher dosages have a major impact on the outcomes of students and how they are successful for the remainder of their lives. And so if people want to follow you, Natalia, where can they find your work? I know you have a huge and very exciting project that is coming to an end and will be shared with the world shortly. So talk about how they can follow you on social media, and please talk about the amazing project that you have coming out before your trip over here to the US.
Thank you. So you can follow me on LinkedIn, Natalia Rachel, or on Instagram, Natalia_Rachel_change, or at my website, nataliarachel.com. And I am so excited. So I've written a book. It's probably the biggest thing I've ever done in my life. I think even bigger than having children. Don't know if it's okay to say that. And it's coming out with Penguin Random House online and in Singapore at the end of August. And in the States, it'll probably be out there towards the end of September, which is when I'm heading over. It's called Why Am I Like This? Illuminating the Traumatized Self. And it's basically my life's work and exploration to answer that question. When we've got unhealed trauma, we wonder, what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why is the world this way? And that inquiry started for me at age 7. So it shares my experience as a patient turned therapist And every chapter takes the reader on a journey through conceptual sharing to very intimate pieces of my personal story. And it provides questions for self-inquiry as well as a somatic meditation to help us start getting into our bodies. So I'm super excited for that to come out. Pre-order will be available soon. And I'm looking forward to coming over to the US to speak about it and to run workshops on touch as well.
Awesome. So please follow her if you need to get in touch, and she will have some availability to availability to speak while she's here. And we're going to try to work on something here together to get her part of the Trauma Informed Educators Network and an opportunity for people to hear her as well. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Natalia. I mean, there's just so much going on in our world today, but you know what? There's always so much going on. This isn't, there's always been, right? And we have to start going, okay, now we understand. And now what am I going to do for myself? And I would be amiss if I didn't say, I'm really excited about next week to think about what are we going to do in the world, right? Because next week there's over 200 fellow, what I call disruptors, coming to Nashville for the Trauma Informed Educators Network Conference. This is our third year. The first was in 2019, which I still am in wonder how the team that I was able to work with, we pulled it off. We walked away, went, wow, that was super fun and super motivating. And we just met some really cool people. And so we did it again last year as a virtual, and this year we're doing it in person. We cannot wait. If you are coming to Nashville next week, I cannot wait to meet you. I cannot wait to have a conversation with you. And hopefully Natalia next year, she can be here with us in Nashville for the Trauma Informed Educators Network of 2023. But you all, I'm very excited. Please follow me on Twitter. I'm on Principal List, or Instagram as Principal List. You can also follow me on Facebook or LinkedIn. I will be tweeting a lot at the conference, and I hope you all will be too. You can follow the hashtag Disruptors Unite or TIE Network 2022, which is our hashtag for the conference. Follow it. There's going to be amazing presenters from all over the country. We actually have 3 presenters from the international presenters as well. And so if you're coming, I'll see you. If not, I'll miss you. And I hope that you can come next year. But thank you all for listening, Natalia. Thank you for sharing so much of your wisdom with us. And I will not be back next week because that's the conference, but I will be back the following week with the next episode. So thank you for listening. And as always, please, please, please just wash your hands. All right, I am done with the podcast, and we are still live. So thank you all. There's several people watching live. I really appreciate it. Remember, these are on YouTube as well. So if something resonated with you, you can go back and watch it, share it with somebody else, share the amazing learning that we all had today, thanks to Natalia. But thank you all for listening. And I will, like I mentioned, I will not be back next week. I will be back the following week. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great night.